Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Z. Welcome to the Age of Nationalism, Part 1. We're going to be talking about what nationalism is and then the Risorgimento, the unification of Italy. First, a caveat. So, 19th century nationalism is not the same as 20th or 21st century nationalism. Nationalism has changed over time. What do I mean by that? In the 19th century, nationalism quite simply was the right for a state to exist, for it to rule itself, for a state to be a state, not an empire. Into the 20th century, the ideas of nationalism get expanded, twisted a little bit, to start to develop into some of the hyper styles of nationalism that we associate with fascism. In the later part of the 20th century, the rise of far-right nationalist parties in Europe, such as the Golden Dawn in Greece, or the Northern League in Italy, or the Swiss People's Party, or there's a number of different ones. The National Front in France is a famous one. Those have a nationalist vibe in the sense of xenophobia and fear of foreigners. Yes, there are connections to the 19th century, but it is quite different. So I want you to understand that just like when we talk about liberalism in the 19th century, it does not mean what liberalism means today. Nationalism in the 19th century also does not mean what nationalism means today. Okay, so we're going to be focused on the 19th century, but of course, as this course goes through the 20th century, into the World Wars and the Cold War era, we certainly will be talking about nationalism as it evolves, but not right now. Okay, just letting you know that. So 19th century nationalism, as we said, is very much about a state having the right to exist without being ruled by outsiders, right? We call this self-determination of the people. It shows up in folk stories and literature and flags, vernacular language, festivals, okay? It can be defined by language. It can be defined by culture. It can be defined by geography. A number of different things can define what a nation is. It also is one of the things that the Congress system forgot about, right? Because the Congress system was all about putting Europe back together again as it had been before the French Revolution. So your key concept outline wants you to know that early nationalism emphasized shared historical and cultural experiences that often threaten traditional elites. And a lot of times these shared histories are sort of what makes a nation, right? As Americans, we're familiar with Uncle Sam, right? And sort of the American ethic of, do what you can for your country and pull yourself up by your bootstraps. In France, they have the figure of Marianne, who you see here from Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. And in Germany, there's the figure of Germania, which is the idea of Germany as it was in the Holy Roman Empire. So the idea of nationalism, gets expressed culturally in ways that actually are fairly familiar and resemble each other. The last point is 19th century leaders promoted national unity through economic development and expanding state functions to meet the challenges posed by industry. Nations in Europe would not have come about if it was not for the Industrial Revolution, I believe. And likewise, we are going to see that those leaders quite often are prime ministers. So it's interesting. We think of nationalisms in the 19th century as ground up revolutionary moments, but in reality, the nations of both Germany and Italy come together as a nation because of top-down governmental state-led wars. So here we go. Let's start with Italy. So what was Italy before unification? Clemens von Metternich said that it was a mere geographical expression. The idea of Italy as a peninsula was named Italia, has been that for millennia, since the Romans, at least. I'm sure someone enterprising out there can go and find out the exact origins of Italia. But it is the idea of that peninsula having a name is a very old one. But what does Metternich mean? He means that Italy doesn't exist as a state because it's owned by 10 different kingdoms. It's also ruled by a lot of outsiders. Habsburgs in the north, Bourbons in the south. The French as well have quite a lot of influence in Rome. Likewise, the Pope. The Papal States, we're going to look at a map in a moment, but the Papal States are most of central Italy, and the Pope has a lot of influence. Also, there's about 20 different languages / dialects. The space between a language and a dialect is kind of vague. All of you out there who study this will laugh at that. It's true, though. People in Sicily would not have been able to communicate easily with people in Milan. The leaders often did not speak the same language as the people that they led. And those linguistic differences were vast. And because Italy has been a peninsula that has been taken over by people from the Middle East, from people from the Balkans, from Greece, right? There's many, many influences that creates what is Italian. There's some wonderful Ottoman architecture in Italy as well, particularly in Puglia. So Italy has a lot of foreign influences, right? So then what is Italian? And that's the big question of the day. So it says here, people in Rome were protected by the French, but they were ruled by the church, right? Which is very true. People in Modena had a vastly different and more autonomous form of government, right, than the people in Venice. So there were different forms of governments. And Venice, of course, was ruled by the Habsburgs, seen as foreigners. And the whole peninsula had not been unified since the fall of Rome in the 400s. So let's look at a map. This map over here gives us a sense of how Italy is sort of divided before the Risorgimento, right? So we're going to start here with the kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia. So this is Piedmont. This is Sardinia. Okay. These were ruled, this was one kingdom. Okay. The Duchy of Tuscany, okay, includes the Tuscan states. Papal states, as I said, here's Rome, right? Papal states, right? Modena, Parma are their own independent places. Lombardy, Venetia, this whole area ruled by the Austrians. Down here, Kingdom of Two Sicilies. Sicily, Naples, right? The boot, this is Campania, Puglia. This whole area, right, ruled by outsiders, mainly the Spanish. So we have lots of problems, right? Plus the Pope protected by the French. So there's a lot of foreign influence on this peninsula. And these are the governmental divides that are on the peninsula in the 1820s. Excuse me, linguistically. Look at all the different languages, right? And a lot of these dialects still exist today. My own family comes from Naples and Benevento, down here in Campania, right? And my family essentially they speak their dialect commonly in the house. I don't speak that dialect. So when I visit them, they switch back and forth into Italian for me. And that's kind of common in Italy. There's lots of local dialects that there's whole books of the different grammar and the different vocabulary words that are used in different places. And for people who, like myself, who learned Italian in American universities and schools, had to learn it as a second language, right? This also poses an issue because listening to Italian in different places can be rather hard. There's a lot of different accents, but there's also the dialects bleed into the language, and depending on where you are, it can be a little bit difficult to understand certain things when you travel, even today. So it's interesting how this version of cultural diversity persists even today, but certainly was really strong in the early 19th century. So people in Italy wanted to unify, but they had sort of questions as to how to do it, right? They wanted to expel the foreign rulers. There were lots of nationalist pamphlets, right? That when we look at them, we can see, oh, the bourgeoisie doesn't like the Habsburgs. The aristocracy doesn't like the Habsburgs. Wow, the bourgeoisie and aristocracy are actually united on this hatred of foreign rule. Liberal aristocracy saw that, hey, we could get more power and wealth, right, if we come together as a country. But how are we going to do that, right? So there's three options. Come together under the Pope, come together under a king, but which king, right? Or come together as a republic, right? So these are sort of three versions, okay? In the end, it's going to become a constitutional monarchy, right? King and republic together, because the least favored means towards nationalism at the time was the Pope. But it was an idea, right? We're going to talk about Mazzini later on in his career. He was advocating that Italy come together under a Pope. It wasn't very popular, though, at the time. So the big question, though, the big takeaway is after the Risorgimento, Italy becomes a country, right? It makes Italy. But does it make Italians, right? So does the nationalism permeate to the people, right? All of these people who are Garibaldi's red shirts, these were all revolutionaries in southern Italy, right? Do they magically feel Italian after this shared experience? Most historians would say no, they do not. A lot of people see that the Risorgimento, right, made Italy, but failed to make Italians. And we'll talk more about that in the end. So Risorgimento is a word, means resurgence of Italy as it had been under Roman rule. And that's the intention of the word, right? That the peninsula had not been brought together since the 400s, right? Since the fall of Rome. So here we have a picture that I really see as kind of indicative of the Risorgimento. And this is the first Italian flag being brought to Florence. And you see this, this young man, this young patriot, because a lot of the fighters in the Risorgimento were young men, late teens, early 20s, who wanted to build a better nation. And the ideas of patriotism and that nationalist sentiment was very strong, right? But here's this, solitary man, right, bringing this first flag of Italy into Florence. So how did it all happen? There's three key people that you need to remember. One is Count Camillo di Cavour. We will refer to him as the brain of the Risorgimento. All right. Giuseppe Garibaldi is the sword, all right, as a general. And Giuseppe Mazzini as the heart. And we're actually going to start with Mazzini. He's the oldest one out of all of them. So Mazzini is a really fascinating character. And if you want to get a good sense of who he is, the Encyclopedia Britannica actually just has a really nice short article that's a biography of his life. And he really is somebody who blends the ideas of nationalism with religion and with working like unionism, syndicalism, the idea of like, this is the working man's duty to God and to country, and God gave us these nations and we are bound to protect them. So, there's a quote here by him: neither Pope nor King, only God and the people will open the way of the future to us. So he tended to dress all in black because he was mourning. He was mourning the idea that Italy was not a nation. So we can tell he's a very dramatic figure, right? This is why we call him the heart, right? The heart of nationalism for Italy. He wanted a republic. He thought that monarchism, liberalism, and socialism were problematic, but he borrows a little bit from each of these ideologies in what he advocates. He thought that unification was a moral force, right? That would make Italians worthy of democracy, right? That if they bound together in this revolution and form a nation, right, then that will, change them and change their character. He really thought that unification had to be from the ground up, not by domination of Piedmont Sardinia. And we'll talk a lot more about Piedmont Sardinia in a second, but that's actually, spoiler alert, that's kind of how unification ends up happening. So he was wrong in that sense, and he was wrong about a lot of things, but he's kind of went down in history as sort of the spiritual heart of what this is, because he forms, in exile, he goes and he forms a organization called Young Italy. And I think at its peak, it had like 60,000 members. And there are lots of young enter name of countries, young Serbia, young Poland. He actually helped form Young Poland. He actually helped form a number of other organizations, nationalist organizations for young men in different countries. But the Young Italy was, he wanted to mobilize the masses. He wanted to form sort of a young Europe, that all of the young working men of Europe would nationalize. This sounds Marxist, right? It's not, okay? while he read Marx, we don't tend to think of him in that way.